Hello and welcome. Today we are discussing, well, I'll just start by introducing myself. I'm Ellen. I'm the peer researcher with EDAC. And would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, my name's Dr. Virginia Carter-Leno. I'm a career development fellow, welcome career development fellow at the Centre for Brain and Cognitive Development at Birkbeck. And yeah, my research largely focuses on trying to understand the increased prevalence of mental health difficulties in autistic children and adults, and trying to think about differences in development and how these might be relevant to supporting autistic people and promoting positive mental health. And most people call me Vinny.
Nice. Yeah, I wasn't sure if you go by Dr. Leno or.
No, Vinny's fine.
Okay, cool. Okay, so it sounds like your research very much aligns with what EDAC is doing. So I'm excited to speak to you today. But we're going to be looking specifically at your recent publication, which is very exciting. Do you want to explain a little bit about what it is and what you did?
Yeah. So this project was kind of slightly different to my usual research, which is very much kind of thinking about brain development and statistical modeling and testing a very specific hypothesis, whereas actually what we wanted to do here is really take a step back from that and think about what are the priorities of research, what research should be done, what topics are more important, and who decides that essentially. And so I don't know if this is true of other fields, but historically, quite often researchers will decide this topic is the most important, or funding bodies might decide that too. And what we wanted to do here is actually ask people with lived experience of the thing we're researching what they felt would be most important, because at the end of the day, that is the population you're trying to support with your research, and they will have insights that you just don't have as someone who doesn't have lived experience. So this, broadly, I think that's a really important thing to do. And then this specifically was about trying to understand the overlap of autism and ADHD and then disordered eating. And this is kind of a fairly newly emerging field. I think the kind of research papers highlighting, at least for autistic people, that the risk for eating disorders was far higher, or that the rates of autism in eating disordered populations are far higher than you would expect based on population prevalence. That's kind of really brought to the surface, or got people thinking about, well, why is this? Why is there increased risk in autism? And then there's been a little bit of work thinking about ADHD as well, which I think is always something to bear in mind when you're thinking about autism, because it will really often co-occur with ADHD, and so you need to be thinking about that too. And so it just really got us thinking, like, what should the priorities be in this newly emerging field? And we should go and ask people that before we kind of charge in. And that would be a helpful thing for future researchers, just to have kind of a set of priorities of what's important in terms of research topics that they could use to guide the research they do in the future, and generally ensure that what people are doing is in line with the kind of priorities from the community.
Yeah, I think it's brilliant, really. I think like it's so interesting that, like, as you say, communities have for such a long time been kind of not kind of listened to or taken into account by research. And I think it is a lot like across different fields, like the priorities come from researchers or funding bodies. So just kind of go back to that.
Mm-hmm.
What was kind of what do you think has kind of shifted that has kind of prompted like your study to do this work and find out actually what are the priorities for the community we're interested in?
Yeah, I don't know. It would be such an interesting, almost like sociological study of how things have shifted. But at least in the autism research field, which is the one I kind of sit more within than the ADHD one. I think autistic people have just really pushed for representation at the table, and I don't know what kind of catalyzed that, but it's definitely, at least in my kind of lifetime as a researcher, felt that there has been this shift with autistic people, or kind of people from the autism community, so also carers and parents, really pushing to be represented in research more. Now, I don't know actually what has what like what was the spark behind that. But I think, yeah, it's just really been this real push, which I think is great, and it's made researchers kind of sit up and listen,
Yeah.
and really think about how you can incorporate people with lived experience, or stakeholders in your research better, or even at all to begin with.
Yeah, I find it, I don't know what you think of this, and I'd be interested to hear, but I find like with the autism and it like neurodivergent communities in general, there's been a real kind of paradigm shift from the
Mm,
kind of medical model to a more kind of social model. Um, and with that shift has come this kind of push to kind of drive research, drive like the priorities for research, drive the kind of community to be leading like
mm,
change themselves, which I think is really good. And I think what's kind of maybe tricky to navigate right now is like what you're talking about, the overlap with mental health conditions, which sit very much more in the medical model,
yeah.
who are like very much more kind of resistant to service users, patients kind of having that same kind of level of representation. They're much
Mm,
more like, we will consult a patient group, but we're not really ready to have priorities set by a group of people with eating disorders, for example.
yeah. I wonder if it will happen though. Like, I think that at least in the autism field, research field, it's really shown how you can do it and how important it is. So I do wonder if other fields will take note. I'm not sure. We shall
Yeah,
see.
yeah. I think it like raises some interesting questions about who has power and who gets to kind of share that power.
Yeah. And yeah, I think it's still all being worked out, at least in my head. Each project, I try and think about these things beforehand, but it's always really complex how you, yeah, address that power imbalance, and how, because certain research topics, it's easier to be almost like a co-produced approach to things, where you really do power sharing, and then other research topics it's much trickier, and that's actually something I'm really interested in, is trying to work out how you could do more kind of biologically driven research in a way, or biomedically research, but basically the focus on kind of understanding early brain development and thinking about mental health, but how you could do that in a more stakeholder-led way, because it gets, that's where I find it tricky to pull those things together a bit more. But it's something I've really trying to think about and hopefully work on in the next kind of 5-year period, is methods for, yeah, doing that more co-produced research. Because I think when you shift from kind of questionnaires and speaking to people, and then you shift to like hardcore metrics of brain functioning, it just gets trickier. But I don't think it's not doable. I just think we need to think about it more. So yeah, it's something I really want to work on more, and hopefully advance stuff in that area.
Yeah, I think like something I'm super interested in is seeing how like co-production kind of evolves and develops as like we move more into like the medical
Yeah.
kind of field.
But I think
So
EDAC is doing a great example of really taking the time to think that through and think about different methods. And yeah, it's been really, really helpful. I think all of the research coming out from there is great. So
we're
yeah.
tracking. Yeah, we'll see how things go. But that's super nice to hear because we always want to learn and progress. So just back to your study, can you like summarize the aims of the research? And like again back to the kind of co-production aspect, like how the aims were prioritized and what that was like?
Mm-hmm. I guess the overarching aim was to create a ranked list, as researchers like lists. You just got to give people a very concrete thing. A ranked top 10 list of research topics that were priorities for people with lived experience. So when I say lived experience, just going back, this was autistic people and or people with ADHD who had experienced disordered eating. We left it very broad, so people didn't have to have a diagnosis to take part in any of those things. They could identify with a diagnosis, because we really didn't want to be gatekeeping in any sense. You know, there are many reasons why people wouldn't or would not get a diagnosis of autism, ADHD, or disordered eating. So very broad. Yeah, and the aim was to bring groups of people with lived experience together to create this top 10. And what was the second part of the question?
And then,
How we
yeah,
did it.
just basically, how did you kind of
Yeah.
put together your list?
So we did, there's a organization called the James Lind Alliance, which does kind of specializes in priority setting projects. So they kind of have suggested methods for how to bring people together and identify and prioritize relevant issues to those groups. So we kind of loosely followed what they had on their website, which is really helpful if anyone's thinking about doing something similar. And so we did kind of a broad sweep to collect a list of possible topics. So that was an online kind of open text survey where 71 people participated, and we basically asked, you know, what do you think are important research topics for trying to understand the overlap of autism, ADHD, and disordered eating? You know, what do you think are some of the risk factors? What do you think are protective factors? What do you think of kind of clinical services? And just try to ask a few questions to get some prompts about. And then the final question was kind of, and what do you think is most important? And then myself and the research assistant who was part of the project, Johanna Keller, who's the first author on the paper. She's now going to graduate school in America. Very exciting for her, although I wish she could stay here. We kind of separately read through all the responses and tried to list the ones that came up kind of the most often. And we narrowed it down to 15 topics, and we kind of discussed it with the other co-authors as well. 15 topics that we thought were kind of a good representation of all the responses and the things that people were saying, were kind of saying that came up quite a lot. And then those were taken through to an online workshop, and that was kind of to get a much more in-depth understanding and try and prioritize. So we didn't prioritize them at this point, we were just collecting possible topics. And so the workshop was then 14 again, neurodivergent people with lived experience of disordered eating. And we basically, through the workshop, I think it was 2 hours, maybe it was a bit longer, we tried to think about the topics in lots of different ways. So at the beginning of the workshop, we basically asked, you know, what are different groups in society that this type of research would be relevant for? And so it was kind of people with lived experience, and then loved ones and people trying to support the person with lived experience. And then it was kind of broader, like, you know, policymakers and governments. And then there was kind of healthcare settings and researchers, and really try to get people in the workshop to think about all these different groups and the potential impact different topics would have for different groups, and like which had the most power to change the experience of the lives of people with lived experience versus healthcare systems, just trying to get people thinking, basically. And then at the end of the workshop, we asked people to rank. So we had these smaller groups that people are in, rank their top 5 topics in order of importance. And then what we did is basically tried to kind of pull all that together, and based on these final rankings, kind of determine the top 10. So yeah, I guess it was like, if you think of like a kind of funnel narrowing down to get to that list. So try and do broad, 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 and then sweep it down into a top 10 there.
Yeah, that is, there's so many questions I want to ask about that. First of all, just going back to like the survey where people could just open text, put in whatever they wanted. Was there anything that was like really surprising that came out of that?
I guess one thing which actually didn't get taken through to a top 10, but I thought was such an obvious thing that like we could do, um, was the importance of the environment that people eat food in, which seems so like obvious and but it was like,
Yeah,
this is not what researchers think about when you think of these complex models of development, da da da.
yeah,
But sometimes it's really as simple as being like, could we just not have like the therapy room next to the canteen, or could we not have really bright lights in the
yeah,
canteen? And that could make a huge difference to someone's life. So it wasn't really surprising, but it really made me like check myself in a way and be like, sometimes you don't need uh,
yeah,
these complex theories to make people's lives better. Sometimes it can be something very small that can be implemented quite easily.
yeah. That's interesting because I feel like there's always quite a lot of emphasis on kind of environmental changes when
Mm,
people talk about making somewhere kind of autism friendly.
mhm,
What they really mean is they've like dimmed the lights
mm.
and turned the music down. And I'm like, you know, like there's more to like
Okay.
adapting something for autistic people than just dimming the
Yeah.
lights. Like,
Yeah, yeah. People had lots of suggestions in terms of how the environment and also
yeah,
like the therapeutic experience could be made a lot better. And that actually came through a bit more in the workshop. But yeah, that was something that stood out. Not really surprising because it has come up in other research projects, but I guess because my current grant is all focused around differences in sensory processing in young children and what might drive that and what the developmental consequences might be if you do have kind of different or atypical sensory processing and yeah, the challenges that might lead to. And so I was quite not reassured, but it made me, I've always thought sensory processing is probably very important. And so to see that coming through from the open-ended text, yeah, was like, okay, yeah, I mean, it's not just me who thinks this.
yeah,
um, it's people with lived experience are kind of saying it too. So that is kind of encouraging because it makes you feel like the project I'm just starting out is, even though it's not about disordered eating, it's not about adults, it's about young children, still that this is a really important thing to understand what the kind of consequences of that later down the line in development could be.
yeah. Like, I think once you learn about sensory processing, things start to fall into place and like you can start to understand why it's actually really important.
Mhm.
um, but if you don't have that kind of experience of like meeting autistic or neurodivergent people, like you might not kind of fully grasp the kind of significance. And then in terms of the prioritizing as a group activity, how did like do you know how people found that or like what that was like? Because in my experience, prioritizing can be quite difficult for autistic people. I'm
Yeah.
autistic with ADHD, so when I say autistic, I kind of mean like I'm autistic and ADHD, but I recognize you had ADHD people who weren't autistic. So I guess more broadly,
Mhm.
autistic and or ADHD.
Yeah. So we tried to make the groups quite small and fairly informal. So, I mean, I can't speak for the other, because kind of all the other people on the project had like a small group that they were, I mean, it was really just sitting in the background and listening and helping if anyone needed to kind of move things around on a slide. Um, so I kind of just reassured people in a way and said, like, let's try and find the priorities, but if you can't decide between two, that's fine, and not make it so rigid in a way, which I hope helped. And I think getting people to think about it in lots of different ways before we ask people to prioritize it, I hope was helpful because it's not just off the bat, right? Let's
Yeah.
prioritize, let's go. But we'd, to that point, I think spent at least an hour, maybe more, discussing what the potential impacts could be and getting people to think about the topics in lots of different ways. So the goal of kind of doing all those little bits before we ask people to prioritize them was to try and give them the time to like play with the ideas in their mind a bit more. Um, and yeah, I think we asked people to do a top 5. I think a lot of people did top 6 or 7, but that's fine because you can use like the rankings of where people put things and the other information about what was that we collected about, if people thought it had the potential to impact X or Y to kind of boil it down. So I'm not saying it's like a perfect science and these are the all-time absolute priorities, because you're asking people's opinion and sometimes it's not that simple, that not everyone's going to agree on everything, but I guess it just hopes to give a sense of what the important things are, and that will guide researchers when they're kind of starting out their projects.
Yeah, I think it makes a lot of sense to think about it like what you were explaining in terms of like how different priorities would be affect like medical settings or journalists or the media or like healthcare, whatever. Um, because whenever somebody tells me to like prioritize something, I'm like, well, based on what? Like
Mm.
on what I need like right here and right now, or what's important for like my broader kind of future, or like, yeah, it's very difficult. And it's something that EDAC's kind of thought a lot about because we've also done some like research priorities and looked at the James Lind stuff. And yeah, it's just very tricky to kind of,
It is tricky because different groups might have different interests or benefit from different things, like the things which could impact, family members supporting someone experiencing disordered eating might be very different from the information that's important for policymakers. And so, yeah, I guess it's trying to get people to think about those things and just accept that there'll be, yeah, a complexity there and there's not going to be one neat solution, but that's fine.
yeah. Did you find like a significant, I don't know how much like demographics you collected,
Mhm.
but was there much difference in how people ranked things based on whether they had um, been diagnosed early in life or whether they were diagnosed with ADHD or
We didn't actually,
different eating disorder
yeah,
experiences?
we didn't look in that kind of granular level, because we only had 14 people in the workshop. And so there's not really enough numbers to look at that. I'm just trying to think through the different people that took part. I would say from collecting the demographics, it is definitely not representative of like the wider autism and ADHD population. And that's something that I've been thinking about quite a bit going forward. So the majority of our sample were white, and a lot of them were women, and a lot of them had at least an undergraduate degree or higher. So that is not a representative sample of like the demographics of the UK. So I do think we need to do more work in the future trying to have more representative samples. And then, yeah, the point about being diagnosed late or early, I'm just thinking about what people had said in the workshop. I actually think quite a few people probably did come to a diagnosis quite late, because I remember people saying that they had felt a lot of shame about their eating patterns because they didn't understand how it related to their neurodivergence, because no one had brought that up or suggested it as something that would be important to them. And so when they then received diagnosis, I think a lot of things slotted into place for them. So yeah, I do think there probably were quite a few people who were diagnosed late. And there's some really interesting research being done, I think mostly using the Auspex sample, looking at mental health um, difficulties in autistic people who get a diagnosis earlier versus later in life, and does that matter? And like, yes, it does. Um, so yeah, but I think that would be a really interesting project to understand how that
Yeah.
relates to disordered eating specifically.
I think
And
it came
yeah.
up in like one of our research priorities was about the timing of the diagnosis.
Mm.
And like a lot of people kind of feeling that had they had it earlier, it would have changed their life trajectory. And yeah, I
Yeah,
guess I wonder about like people with ADHD, whether they had a different experience or just, yeah, there's so many questions you could ask with like a kind of mixed range because we're only really kind of starting. Like, I feel like the research on autism, on ADHD and eating disorders is a few years behind. Um,
definitely. And
and
actually,
also like
yeah,
the overlap of autism and ADHD is also lagging.
Yeah, I remember actually in the group I was in, one of the participants who was a woman with ADHD saying, why isn't there much research about the overlap of ADHD and disordered eating? Like it's just as important, and the risk is increased as it is in autism, and there's just not as much out there. I mean, I think that's changing now, and again, I think that might also be part in terms of people with ADHD being advocates for the community and really pushing for the type of research they want to see. Because for a long time, and still ongoing, the ADHD research is very biomedical about differences in the brain associated with ADHD, which is like an important research question, but I think much less focus has been put on the lived experience of people with ADHD, and especially women as well. I think that's also really coming through, is misdiagnosis or missed diagnosis, both of women with ADHD.
Yeah, and I think there's still like a kind of stereotype of ADHD where it's just kind of like impulsivity and maybe binge eating is kind of the only kind of research that's been done so far because
Mm,
of like that was the kind of that fit the impulsive behavior
yeah,
leads to XYZ,
yeah.
and that's it. When actually, when you look at the overlap of autism and ADHD, there's so many traits that are just very similar in terms of like sensory issues,
Mhm.
emotional regulation, like
Yeah, we're trying to address this in another piece of work that Johanna did before she sadly left us, was looking at the links between early autistic traits and later eating patterns, but also ADHD traits. Because I could find one paper in the literature which had both measurement of autism and ADHD and had looked at the links to disordered eating, which is mad to me. Like one paper.
yeah,
So yeah, we're like trying to start thinking about that and really acknowledging the co-occurrence between autism and ADHD. Yeah, that is kind of more the rule than the exception.
yeah, like it seems mad, but like at the same time, you could only this recent that they could only be
Yeah,
diagnosed
that's true.
separately,
Yeah,
which people are so surprised to find out.
yeah,
Um, it still blows my mind. 2013, like that
yeah.
feels like just so recent. Um, yeah. So, do you want to talk through the some of the top priorities and what
Yeah,
they what they mean?
yeah. One thing I wanted to say about the kind of involving people in the method is that I, in hindsight, wish that we had involved someone with lived experience in the research team. I think that's actually what we needed for it to be a better study and a more kind of co-produced study. So I'm very hesitant to use the word co-produced about the research, because I think it was done collaboratively in that all of the information that drove the results came from people with lived experience, including how things were ranked and how we interpreted the data. But I think, yeah, now I have more time and more funding, I can really build in these things from the research from the get-go. But it's just really challenging when you have a small pot of money that needs to be spent in 3 months
Yeah.
to really bring someone on board in a meaningful way. Because I didn't want to do something where someone it felt tokenistic, or someone didn't feel like it was a safe space, or I just, it's something that's been playing on my mind, and it's what I want to do in the future. So I just always lay that out there, because I don't want people to think it was this amazing co-produced thing, because there's always things we could have done better.
Yeah, I think that's important to kind of acknowledge, but also
Yeah.
like to be reflecting on is like the value of co-production and what it
Mm,
means or what it can bring
mm,
at different levels, and doing something like your project and how that could have been different or how it will be different next time with kind of a team member.
yeah.
I like to think I bring value to EDAC.
I'm sure you do. Anyway, all right. So what was the question?
So just to talk through some of the findings of
Oh yeah, the
your
findings. Yeah. So I've got my top 10 list here. So the main thing that came through, which I think will not be surprising for anyone, is that improving clinical care and support were some of the top priorities. And so the number one was, how can treatment for disordered eating be improved for neurodivergent individuals? Number three, what is the effect of neurodiversity training and knowledge in clinical services for eating disorders? Number four, which I found really interesting, just because I think as a field, psychologists don't think about this enough, is what treatment interventions are for disordered eating could be actively unhelpful for neurodivergent individuals. So I think if you run a big trial of, like a pharmaceutical trial of a drug, of course you collect information about adverse effects. But when people run trials for psychological therapies, I had a look, and it's very rare that people collect information about adverse effects. And then if you think about that, we know that clinical services are just not as effective, and they're not meeting the needs of especially autistic people, because I think we know more here, autistic people with disordered eating, then it really makes you think about not just how can we improve things to make them better, but actually which bits of it are making things worse potentially. So I think that's important distinction to draw. How can we improve clinical services, but not just saying, oh, let's add more things on or make it, but actually thinking and talking to people about their experiences of clinical care and trying to understand which bits could have negative consequences. So yeah.
Yeah, that's such a good point. Like, I know the Royal College of Psychiatrists have their like guide to autism, and they're very clear that treatment that's not adapted or modified for autistic people can be ineffective at best, but harmful at worst.
Mm-hmm.
And the harmful bit is never kind of spoken about. And so
Mm-hmm.
often I see people promoting different types of therapy or like pathways for care, saying like something is better than nothing.
Mm.
And that really makes me so uneasy, because when you listen to autistic people, like harm from treatment is like, it's one of the first things that comes up.
Mm.
And I just don't think we're like actually listening to that side of what's going on.
Yeah. Yeah, so I really hope that will encourage people who do some sort of trial. I mean, that's not my specialty, running clinical trials, but to really consider um, which things could be actively unhelpful, and ask people with lived experience to input in, making that list of things that they ask about in any future trials. So yeah, the clinical kind of first cluster, the way we talked about it in the paper, it's the first cluster, which was really the things that were very high on the list, was about improving clinical services. There was also another, the neurodiversity training and knowledge in clinical services. And then there was another priority, which was about, would better information and education reduce risks for neurodivergent people? And that was about information education for the person themselves. So I think there's kind of two groups of people that maybe need more information. So one of them is the people like the GPs, people within clinical services, and then people are saying, had I really understood what this, my patterns of eating represented, or, the potential consequences of going down this route of only eating certain things, or not realizing when I was hungry, and the health consequences of that. I really wish I'd known more earlier, so I hadn't things hadn't gotten as bad as they had. So I think, yeah, that kind of part of the clinical care is also just giving people information, and making sure people feel empowered to understand, when they might want to seek clinical services, and when they might need support, and what things they might want to change, and what things actually they don't need to change. And that's kind of part of their, I think someone used the phrase kind of neuro identity, like almost not demonizing everything, and understanding which parts of how you eat are kind of just related to the way you are. And you don't need to feel kind of guilty about that, and you don't need to go to clinical services if you don't want to. And so yeah, I think that's also a very interesting thing to think about, is what information is helpful for people. And it kind of harks back to your question about diagnosis, like not just focusing on the disordered eating, but the whole picture of a person. um yeah,
Yeah,
anyway, that's a bit
like
of a tangent, but
I guess like kind of post-diagnosis support or follow-up.
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. um And then the second group was more about kind of identifying risk factors. So I guess the idea being that these things would drive improvements in clinical care if you could understand, yeah, what was driving disordered eating or yeah, eating disorders in neurodivergent people better, then you could design interventions or even kind of preventative efforts so that things don't reach such a high level of clinical need for that person. And there it was, people wanted to know. So number two was what are the factors that can increase risk? So people really broadly wanted to understand why the risk for disordered eating was higher in neurodivergent people. And then number five, which is quite interesting, is is there a difference in the underlying reasons for disordered eating in neurodivergent people as compared to neurotypical people? And this kind of harks back to treatment as well and intervention, because if the risk factors or the kind of underlying mechanisms are different, then of course the treatment should be different. And it would make sense why autistic people who go through a kind of standard eating disorder pathway, their needs are just not met by what's being offered at the moment. And then people kind of pointed to some more specific risk factors, which I think is really helpful because it gives us some things to actually get going on looking at. So number seven was, is there a link between ADHD characteristics and eating disorders? So people just wanted more research on ADHD, as we talked about. Number eight was, how do difficulties in executive function affect eating behaviors and potentially increase the risk for disordered eating? Number nine, is there a link between sensory sensitivities and disordered eating? And number 10, do different thinking styles, for example, black and white thinking, contribute to disordered eating behaviors? So I think those three are very clear mechanisms that we could go and look at right now. And there are some data sets which have information on executive functioning, fewer about sensory differences, because as we talked about, I just don't think that's something that a lot of people have thought about until fairly recently. And then different thinking styles, like black and white thinking, harder to measure, so that might need some novel data collection. But I do think, as a researcher, I find it quite helpful just to have like a very concrete thing that's like, okay, this is something that people think could be an important mechanism. So we could go out there and see if there's existing data sets, or if not, we could start to collect some data to really start to address that. In addition to all the questions about clinical care and improving that, I think this type of more mechanistic, almost, yeah, kind of underlying model research is what's needed too.
Yeah, I like those because not only are they specific, but they're specific to neurodivergent people.
Mm,
And I think, like, aside from things like cognitive remediation therapy, which kind of tries to fix those kind of thinking styles, which, like, is quite harmful to autistic people,
mm,
um, like, there's not been a kind of targeted like, it's difficult to like think, like, you need a treatment for the eating disorder that supports and affirms autistic and ADHD identities,
mm,
but supports recovery from the
mm,
eating disorder
mm.
while also kind of recognizing that like sensory issues are not going to change and
Yeah.
thinking styles are not going to change. So like cognitive remediation therapy has like attempted to change the thinking
Mhm.
style. So it's quite problematic. But like there was a recognition there that this black and white thinking was a factor.
Yeah, no, and I guess the way I think about it is that, as you say, these things are part of, yeah, someone's kind of neurodivergent identity and experience. And I'm not saying they should be treatment targets. Like, we're not going to be able to shift sensory sensitivities with
Yeah.
some, a few therapy sessions, but it's more a recognition. So thinking about the executive function, for example, how do they affect eating behaviors? So this people talking about finding it hard to, cook the type of meal they would want, like a balanced and healthy meal, because there are so many steps, or eating on a regular basis, like going to the supermarket and remembering all the steps is very challenging for some people. And so, okay, could we put things put things in place to support people who think might have executive function difficulties and they're contributing to disordered eating that they're experiencing, to try and not mitigate, but kind of just acknowledge these difficulties. Because
Yeah.
I think saying like, oh, well, we're not going to touch that is not helpful for someone who's
Yeah.
asking for support. So, and again, with the sensory sensitivities, I think you can think about it in terms of, the environment and why people only want to eat certain things, and rather than pushing someone to say, well, you have to eat a wider range and that's just how it is, that's part of your recovery, is maybe thinking this is related to sensory sensitivities, and so maybe actually we should just not expect people to eat such a wide range, or we should say, okay, these are particular textures that actually you really can't handle, so let's put those to one side and try and think about other foods which don't have those textures but maybe have the kind of nutritional needs that you need to fulfill. So in my mind, it's not, yeah, we're going to give you a pill to fix this thing, but it's just bringing them into, yeah, a more nuanced version of support for someone.
Yeah, 100%. And I think it's also like it's about acknowledging that those are like relevant factors
Yeah.
and like working with them and then finding ways to kind of work with the person anyway,
Mm,
not just being like, this is the therapy we offer,
mm,
so we're going to do this regardless. And I think as well, like, not just acknowledging that those are inherent factors in like maybe developing a maintenance of an eating disorder, but that they're part of the person and that's like an acceptable like thing and it's fine. I think like a lot of treatment focuses on kind of getting the person back to like normal eating and like doing normal things, when actually for that person that's quite a harmful narrative, because normal
mm.
for them is
Yeah,
maybe,
different.
yeah, and that's absolutely fine.
Yeah.
um
Well, I guess that harks back to the kind of the point about people wanting to know the effects of neurodiversity training and knowledge in clinical services. Like, I guess we phrased it here like a research question, like, would that
yeah,
improve outcomes for people? But you could argue that actually it's not a research question, it's just like a basic thing that should be
yeah,
implemented within
yeah,
services, is to, yeah, to have this knowledge so that people providing care, as you say, know, yeah, don't push people to see parts of themselves as disordered, potentially.
yeah. Nice.
I think that's kind of the whole list that I've talked through. So I think, yeah, it's kind of the two groups of clinically focused questions and then more underlying mechanisms, risk factor questions. So at the moment, we're just thinking as a team about where we want to go next. Kind of, can we tackle both of those things in one grant? Might be a bit ambitious,
Yeah, that was going
but
to be my next question. Like, what do you do with these priorities?
I think a simple, like, one thing I have been trying to do is just comb through existing longitudinal data sets and see if we could answer any of these questions with existing data. Researchers collect so much data all the time, and so sometimes you don't need to go out, and it's so much effort to collect decent data, and so it's also asking people quite a lot sometimes. So I really think you should, if you have the information you need to answer your research question, then I think start with that. So yeah, trying to answer more the ones about the kind of risk factors using existing data sets. And then, yeah, I think we've just been thinking about how we could try and tackle or advance some of the questions about clinical care in a grant. So whether that would be trying to bring information together for some sort of, educational outputs that people could access, and as trying to do that in a kind of properly co-produced manner. Um, I think that's where we might head, but we're still kind of early days, just brainstorming. Yeah, what would be the best one to kind of start with? Because yeah, they are quite nebulous, some of them, and I'm not a clinician, so I'm not going to be going in and like changing practice, but I want to provide something for people, in clinical services so that it can, improve experiences of neurodivergent people. And it's just thinking how you get there, I guess, what are the steps are, um, to provide that information that people want. And most importantly, I think also evaluate it, as we talked about, to see if it's effective and if it's helpful, or actually is it not helpful at all, and is it unhelpful? So there are kind of lots of different steps, thinking about potentially a new intervention or some new educational tools. I think working with people with lived experience to understand what they want in those sort of informational packs, and making sure that they're really representing the views of people with lived experience. And then I think taking them out, and either they're for people with lived experience or they're for clinicians, and almost road testing them and seeing if they're helpful or not. And then that would be like the kind of first steps towards some sort of proper trial, which probably someone who's trained in trials would do. But I think that's where we're at the moment.
Yeah, it seems like such a long road from like research to trial to getting it like
Yeah,
disseminated around like.
yeah. I think you just have to. Nothing in research is speedy, and you just have to accept that's like part of the field. I have friends who work in like other jobs who, when I say, it's probably 10 years on average from a paper being published to anything being implemented or changed in healthcare services, and they just shake their heads in disbelief that I would have the patience. um, and even running like a robust research study can take years as well, but to do it properly it takes time. Like, there are no shortcuts. So yeah, that's how it is.
Yeah, 100%. But I think like just the fact that like this was done with autistic people does like take us back to the beginning of this kind of paradigm shift where autistic people are kind of shaping research,
Mm.
which I think is really important. So just on that note, like how are you disseminating this research like within the autistic community?
Yeah, that's something I've been thinking about quite a lot, because it's something people said in the workshop. It's like, we want to know the outcome of this research. It's really important to us. Um, and so I went and spoke to the kind of research and engagement office, to try and find a kind of, what in an ideal world it would be a small grant that could pay someone, I think ideally a neurodivergent person who's also a graphic designer or illustrator, to make something really accessible and engaging, which is like a 1 or 2 page summary of the research, kind of to give people a sense of the top line findings so they can really understand the results quickly. And then if they want to go and read the paper in greater detail, they can. It's just there aren't that many pots of money around that support these. So I'm actually now considering just, rejigging things around in my current grant, and because I really want to do this. So I actually spoke to one of the people in the workshop about it, because she was saying I would really value like an accessible version of it, and I'd be happy to kind of work on it with you. So I've been kind of following up with her to see if we could do something together, because that's what I would really like to do, because I think it's really important that research is presented in an accessible manner. And it's a shame in a way that funding bodies don't always appreciate that costs money
Yeah.
to do it properly. So yes, it's on my list, and I'm trying to figure out the best way to do it currently. And then in terms of kind of disseminating more broadly, I really want a lot of people to read this paper, because I think it could shape the type of research people do in the future, which is important. And I want the research to reflect what people with lived experience want done. So yeah, normally I don't really like anything, as we talked about before the call, public facing, but I think I just have to kind of get over that and really try and put it out there a bit more. So I have been working with university press offices and trying to, I think, contact relevant charities to really try and disseminate it. It'll probably be quite a lot of it on social media to, get as many people aware of it as possible.
Amazing. We will link it below this interview, as well as the James Lind Alliance, and everything else that has been mentioned today. And excited to see where it goes next.
I just add, if people had any, if they read it or if they watch this and they have any thoughts or feedback or anything, then please do just email me. My email box always open, and I'm very happy to feedback or chatting about stuff. So
We will put your email address
yeah.
in as well. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Has it stopped?
Uh,
No. Stop recording.